So I am at ETSI Security Conference and I'm joined by Scott Cadzow from Cadzow Communications Consulting Ltd. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And taking the time, Scott. So just to begin with, could you please introduce yourself and your background in security and standards a little bit?
Okay, I'm Scott Cadzow. I've been here in standards for the best part of 30 years now. Background before that was in various forms of software and hardware technology for security and associated systems. So yeah, I think that's the shortest summary I could give, and it will come clear later on exactly what that means.
Okay, thank you. And this week you are chairing the session on IoT Industry Verticals, looking at the challenge in moving from horizontal standards to vertical standards, vertical domains. Sorry. Just to kind of start with, for people who may not be familiar with some of the terminology, what do you mean by horizontal and kind of vertical domains?
What we really mean by horizontal is trying to make something that fits as broadly as possible. So, I mean, also, when we talk about horizons, it's as far as you can possibly see. When we talk about horizontal standards, it's trying to cover as much of what you can possibly see in the technology landscape. But that's terribly one-dimensional. Unfortunately. And so what we mean by vertical is sometimes that horizontal view doesn't go down deep enough, and sometimes we have to go slightly deeper. So whilst we want the horizontal to be broad and deep, it sometimes simply isn't deep enough, and sometimes we have to go down beyond what you can see and into some of the more nitty-gritty. So vertical standardization is generally the bits we can't see, but still need to be covered by standards to make things work, if that makes sense.
Yes, and in the session you're going to talk about ETSI EN 303645 as a baseline.
Yeah.
Can you explain the standard a little bit and how it acts as a baseline for security for IoT devices?
So where we start with 303645 is very much that IoT devices, IoT services were very poorly or insecure. They're often just put in the market without any thinking of security. So what we wanted is some very simple, very basic principles, like make sure you don't use the same password for everything, make sure that the devices got some consideration of security, make sure your private data is properly kept private, all those kind of very simple things, and try and make those as simple as possible to follow so you can get a very simple baseline. I keep on repeating the word simple because that's the point. We're trying. Security shouldn't be difficult. Security should be something you automatically think about, but very few people knew where to start from.
Yeah.
So what EN 303645 does is identify the simple things you have to do and guide you how to do them. And then from there, where we want to go further is make it slightly more technology centric. You'll actually bring the technology. So it starts off with guiding principles, and then from guiding principles towards a bit more depth on the security side. So I think that's where we're going from. So
okay, so the standard kind of makes things slightly simpler so you can apply them more broadly to lots of situations. Yeah,
and try to stop people making stupid mistakes, which is what they were doing all the time. So
what kind of mistakes would you say this one really covers?
The obvious one is default passwords.
Yeah.
And people just use this. Or rather, manufacturers supplied every piece of kit with the same password. And because users weren't given guidance on how to change that password, huge amounts of kit is out there on the market where if you know the password for your device, you'll know the password for everyone else's. And that just, it gives the impression of security in that I have a password to access it, but there is no security because everyone uses the same password. And if that password is something trivial like the word password, it's even worse, because even without knowing that there's a default password, you can guess it very easily. So we wanted to change that mindset and make manufacturers and users aware of the difficulty and the challenge of doing things properly. Don't use the same password on all devices. Use passwords everywhere, and as manufacturers, don't ship everything out with the same password because nobody's going to change it.
Yeah. It seems something, when you say it like that, it sounds so obvious. I guess for many manufacturers and consumers who might not think about it.
The problem we've had in security for a long time is security seems to be a difficult thing to do, and it's a difficult thing to approach. And in practice, it's a set of very simple principles. If somebody doesn't have to see your data, make sure they don't. So Yeah, I mean, you cover that with fancy crypto stuff and fancy words like access control, but ultimately it just means knowing who has to see what you're using and what your data is, and making sure that only the right people can do it, and that's what the principles are all about.
Okay, thank you. And moving on now to looking at some of the verticals, what are the challenges when extending your kind of broader standards from horizontal to vertical
Well,
specializations?
the difficulty is partly cultural, I think,
Okay.
in that everyone sees themselves as special, and so they're not part of the broad core. So, whilst we're trying to make the horizontal fit to everything, everyone is an individual. If you think of individuals, do not see themselves as part of the crowd. They see themselves as special. And unfortunately, industry and technology tend to do the same thing. It thinks, all right, I'm really special. I'm the intelligent transport systems. So I develop cars. Cars are not the same as smartphones. Therefore, I'm special. And if you actually drill down into it, they do the same sort of things. They still have identities. They still have connections. They still have some means of accessing data. And so what we're trying to do is make sure they understand the broad principles and make those broad principles fit to their environments. So sometimes it needs very small changes in how you map the culture or map the environment. So one of the big verticalizations we did was home gateway. And the big difference in home gateway and any other device is home gateway, it sits in two worlds at the same time. It sits in your home and it sits in the internet. And we've got to make sure that the internet connection side is good and secure, but we also need to make sure the home environment's secure, because if somebody comes in and exploits your house, then you want to make sure they're not going to exploit your devices in the house. So it didn't take a lot of changes, but it made minor extensions, so we had to think of those two domains together. And again, it's a lot of very simple things, just giving advice on how they do it. And by making those very small steps, you suddenly make devices which were massively insecure, a few years ago. Now they're giving you foundations for doing your online business. So things like home working, which has seen a huge amount through COVID, but home banking, all those kind of things we do now from home,
Yeah.
we can do knowing that our devices aren't going to be working against us. And that's what we're trying to make sure. Devices aren't our enemy anymore, they're our friend in making our system secure.
Okay, and you mentioned previously with the password example that the manufacturers and the consumers, who are the kind of players who this is really important to know?
The manufacturers are also important, but also we're pushing this also into guidance from member states or from governments. So governments are not going to allow devices on the market which are going to cause their citizens problems. So we've been working very closely as a standards body with government, with the manufacturers, and making sure everyone essentially buys into the same set of guidelines. That no, we're all in this together. We can't afford for governments to neglect their citizens. We can't afford for citizens to abuse other citizens, and we can't afford manufacturers to abuse either. So we've brought them all together in the same room. We've managed to get them to agree to these common principles, and they're now moving towards. Well, we've done those common principles for base IoT. Can we move it further and further? And the whole point of moving from just the horizontal to the vertical is making sure that the principles are accepted by more and more people. So ultimately, in the nirvana of a future, we'll have an awful lot of people adopting the same principles throughout, and then extending those principles in very, very small ways to meet an even bigger audience. And then we'll reflect that in a better horizontal, and eventually we'll have the world being secure with very simple things going on. Good passwords, good security, or good considerations of security throughout. And then it becomes essentially you've gathered a momentum and it just keeps on going. And it becomes essentially a perpetual machine. You always think of security first.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And as we are at ETSI Security Conference, you kind of touched on this with saying that standards kind of set a baseline, but how important really are standards for achieving this?
Well, I'm a standards guru. I mean, I'm a standards advocate very much. I think standards are essential. It's like we use standards all the time. Some of them are really bad, but if you go and buy a pair of shoes, and you know that you're a size 8 is well, well, size 8 UK is different from size
Yeah,
8.
yeah, yeah.
But essentially, when you go and buy a pair of shoes, you buy a standard size. When you go and buy some clothes, they're a standard size. When you build houses, all our houses are built from a set of standard size bricks and standard size, the cabling and the piping is all standard size, and it makes it work. And standards are essentially that foundation for innovation, because then you can go and buy from multiple suppliers. You can know that when you buy from vendor A or from vendor B, that it doesn't matter. They follow the same standard. They'll fit together. They'll work. And so standards become fundamental to making our modern society work, because our modern society is built from devices and things that have to work together. And if we didn't have standards, we wouldn't have telecoms, we wouldn't have the internet, we wouldn't have modern housing. We'd still be scratching a living from the earth, and we're way beyond that. And the reason we're way beyond there is because standards have helped us do that.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Scott. We're kind of coming to the end of our time now, but thank you so much for joining me for this time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the security conference.
Thank you for your time. Great.